gave me this book. It's the story of Ruth, and it's a wonderful book because it includes both text and images. And it has images by one of my favorite local artists in Los Angeles. His name is John August Swanson, and some time ago, he created these images of the book of Ruth. And there's 12 panels, and they tell the entire story of the book of Ruth in these 12 panels. And then Sister Joan Chittiser has written 12 seasons of a woman's life based on these 12 scenes, which really take us through the very short book of Ruth, which is only 4 chapters. And one of the things that Sister Joan talks about when she talks about Ruth and Naomi in this book is that she begins the first season with loss. And it's very important that we not gloss over the catastrophic loss faced by Ruth and Orpah and Naomi in this book. It's very easy to get to the other part and see the good that came out of it. But in life, it doesn't work like that. When we have catastrophic loss, we have to work through that grief in order to come through to the other side. And we see that how much that grief has affected Naomi, because later in the book of Ruth, she uses the word bitter, wants to see herself as Mara, as bitter, because of the hard things that have happened to her. So being a widow in the times of Ruth was catastrophic. It's hard enough to lose your husband, but in this case, they lost their status, their security, their identity. Everything was tied to their relationship to some man in their family. And now the father was gone and the 2 sons are gone. And surprisingly, after 10 years, there are no children. There are no heirs. And so we have these 3 women alone in the world, faced with what to do in the midst of this catastrophic loss. They start along, they decide to go back. They hear that the famine is over that brought them to Moab, and the 3 of the women begin this very long journey. I think it's something like 2,000 miles, but I'm sure 2,000. It's a really long journey when you don't have the transportation we have now. And of course, it's a perilous journey for women. And somewhere along the journey, we don't know how far, Naomi stops, and she invites her daughters-in-law to go back. Go back to where you belong. Go back to where you might have some security. Go back to where maybe you can find a husband and have a future. And eventually, Orpah does decide to go back. And it's an honorable choice. It's the cultural choice. It makes sense for her to go back. Culturally, going back and getting married with someone from her own people makes perfect sense. But it's Ruth. It's Ruth that makes the countercultural choice. I love Ignatian contemplation. So Ignatian contemplation is a practice where we imagine ourselves in the story of Scripture. And so I've imagined myself in the story. And I've imagined being Naomi. And I've tried to feel and picture and imagine the loss and the emptiness and the absolute desolation of her life. And how it must have been very comforting for her at first to have the 2 daughters-in-law go with her, because at least they could accompany each other. And yet, because she loves them, I believe because she loves them, she stops and encourages them to go back to their people. And then we have Ruth. How did Ruth make this choice? So it's a radical countercultural choice to go to a place where she will be the foreigner, she will be the outcast. She's going into the great unknown, and yet she chooses for Naomi. She chooses for a life of uncertainty, and she chooses ultimately for Naomi's God. As I've pondered it, I've wondered how God was drawing her. And we don't know that from this story, but we know the character of God. And we know God's heart and the way God draws people to himself. And so I'm imagining that through her relationships, because she married into this family from Bethlehem, right? Israelite family, that she saw things that she was drawn to, a certain way of being in the world, a certain way of belief, maybe a way of compassion. God calls his people to be compassionate, that she saw things that she was drawn to. It wasn't a blind choice in that way. And the other thing that strikes me about Ruth's choice is women in that time period really had very little choices in life. And yet she ends up with having a radical choice. And she makes the surprising choice. And I think, as I pictured who Ruth is, I think she was spunky. She had already married an Israelite, so she had already married out of her people. But she was like one spunky young woman, willing to do this. And, a lot of can be said, yes, I think she really loved Naomi. But just love for a person doesn't mean that we turn our back on everything we've known and go to a place where we've never been. And Ruth takes a certain of what we call agency in her life. She makes the choice for her life as a woman in a place that had very few choices, which is really, I think, a remarkable piece of the story is the way Ruth, and other times you see Ruth really taking agency in her life, going out and gleaning. And so the two women take off and they go on.